very, very excited about this event. Thank you everybody for attending. As some of you may know, I gave a talk last summer on crypto for the people. And I got a lot of emails from faculty at different universities and from students as well asking, like, what exactly do you mean, right? Like, what exactly do you mean by computing for the people or crypto for the people? And so with CSREA, with Trisha and Stephanie, we thought like it would be great to have an event that highlights what we mean by this, right? Highlight great work spanning from research to activism that really captures the kind of things that we have in mind. So that's why I'm so excited about this event and about our speakers. So the first speaker is Glencora Borradaile. They're an associate professor and associate school head of computer science at Oregon State. They're on the advisory board of the Civil Liberties Defense Center, where they initiated and continue to build a digital security program which supports activists and their lawyers. They've initiated a research program which is really important and interesting. The mission is to support the digital needs of activists and to ensure that everyone can communicate freely and safely regardless of their identity. So they also created and teach a fantastic course. It's an interdisciplinary course on communication security and social movements. So I really, I encourage everybody to look that course up and to look at the syllabus. It's really like the first course on the subject from a computer, in computer science department that I've seen. And it's offered through the Difference, Power, and Discrimination program at Oregon State. Also want to highlight the fact that Cora is a graduate from Brown. They got their PhD in working in algorithms with Phil Klein in 2008. So the second speaker is Elissa Redmiles, who is a faculty member and the leader of the research group, the Safety and Society group at the Max Planck Institute. She also serves as a consultant and researcher at Microsoft Research and Facebook. Her work is really very interdisciplinary. So she uses computational techniques, economics, and social science methods to understand people's security, privacy, and online safety needs and the decision-making process. So her work has been featured everywhere, including the New York Times, Scientific American, Wired, Newsweek. And it's also been recognized by really prestigious awards like the Distinguished Paper Award at Usenet Security. She's also the recipient of a Facebook Research Award and the John Carrot Usable Privacy and Security Research Award. And Elissa got her PhD from University of Maryland. So our third speaker is Matt Mitchell, who is a hacker and the founder of cryptoharlem. He's also a tech fellow at the Ford Foundation, so where he develops a cybersecurity strategy for the foundation's grantee partners. So Matt is a well-known security researcher. He also works as an operational security trainer and has also worked as a data journalist as well. And his organization, cryptoharlem, which is awesome, basically hosts workshops that teach cryptography and privacy tools to the mostly African-American community of Harlem. So Matt has worked as an independent security researcher, as a counter-surveillance trainer for media and humanitarian groups. And his personal work focuses on marginalized, aggressively monitored, and over-policed populations in the United States. So Matt is also involved with a lot of organizations. Basically, like if you're an organization that has to think deeply about security and privacy, you call Matt, right? That's basically what it is. And so he works with Action Squared, the Open Technology Fund, the Internet Freedom Festival, the Digital Security Exchange, the National Association of Criminal and Defense Lawyers, and on and on and on. Ask him about all of that work when you get a chance. So yeah, so I'm very excited about our guests and about this event. And with that, I'll let Cora start it off with her talk.
Great, thank you. I'm so honored to be here. Yeah, that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. I was blushing. So I'm going to talk about the impact that surveillance has on social movements in the US. And I'm going to start with a very short and very incomplete history of surveillance of US activist movements, starting with the Red Scare. So in the 20s through 50s, communist and social worker movements focused on uniting workers across industrial divisions as well as race divisions, and engaged in explicitly anti-racist organizing, one of the only areas of that kind of organizing at the time. This organizing really felt the brunt of McCarthyism, the government's suppression of communism, which happened through FPI's Cominfil program, or Communist Infiltration Program, which used extreme tactics to infiltrate and suppress communist movements. And we also saw that the government required government workers to disavow communism. And we see that presently, for example, in Texas, where government workers have been required to disavow the boycott, divest, and sanction movement that is in support of a free Palestine. Later on, the COINTELPRO, or counterintelligence program of the FBI, grew out of Cominfil and had a greater scope in terms of tactics that they used, that the FBI used, as well as the movements that the FBI targeted. But it did grow from initially focusing on movements that had overlap with communist movements. The document shown here is one of the first that came to light of COINTELPRO and reflects one major intent of COINTELPRO. That is that they wanted to have more interviews with these subjects and hangers-on in order that it will enhance the paranoia endemic in these circles, so that they believe that there was an FBI agent behind every mailbox. And there's some other gems when you look at original documents in terms of the FBI's view of itself. Later in this letter, it says that, quote, "Some targets will be overcome by the overwhelming personalities of the contacting agent and volunteer to tell all." So COINTELPRO largely focused its efforts on leftist movements and had a large lens on the movements of and growing from the civil rights era, from the reformist movements of the classic era of the civil rights movement, which had many gains, despite the suppression from the government, to separatist movements such as invoked by the Black Panther Party and the Nation of Islam. All of these movements were swept up under the Black nationalist hate rubric, that's in quotes, that's FBI's words, of COINTELPRO, whose purpose was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalist hate-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, and supporters, and to counter their propensity for violence and civil disorder. Notably, COINTELPRO had a long campaign of harassing Martin Luther King Jr., and it included tactics such as old school wiretapping and mail opening, infiltrating movements and using agent provocateur, and inciting violence. Those tactics continue today. This was covered extensively by Will Potter in his reporting and book, Green is the New Red, where he reports of these types of COINTELPRO style tactics against the environmental and animal rights movement into the current century in an era that we call the Green Scare. The Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and Patriot Acts were used, have been used and continue to be used against animal and environmental activists to charge them with crimes that normally wouldn't be crimes, or to give harsher sentences to things that already were crimes. In the last half decade, we have seen tactics become more extreme against environmental, Indigenous rights, and Black Lives Matter movements. Most notably, during the Native-led defense of Standing Rock from the construction of a pipeline, we saw the Dakota Access Pipeline Company hire a mercenary outfit, Tiger Swan, that used both old-school tactics, including infiltration and dog attacks, just as both those tactics were used during the civil rights movement, and high-tech tactics such as social media monitoring, surveillance drones, and cell site simulators, which intercept cell phone transmissions. Indeed, in the modern era, there is an increasing partnership between corporations and the state in social movement suppression. While in the past, government surveillance may have been done in the interest of corporations, now we see companies doing the surveillance on behalf of the government and corporations. Sarah Brain argues that companies have fewer restrictions on what kind of data they collect and surveil, since they aren't bound by the necessity for warrants, for example. So during Standing Rock, we saw that corporations were doing the spying on the ground and from the air, feeding information to local police. And we've seen similar tactics being used in Southern Oregon in the fight against the construction of an LNG export terminal. Social media surveillance in particular has become big business, with a near continuous stream of stories of how social media monitoring companies are monitoring protected free speech, notably Black Lives Matter movements, and marketing their services to police for this use. Geophedia is one such company that marketed their product to law enforcement agencies for use in monitoring activists and protesters, and was subsequently used by Oakland and Baltimore law enforcement to monitor, identify, and in some cases, arrest Black Lives Matter protesters. After this was discovered, Twitter and Instagram revoked Geofedia's access to their feeds. But this is largely a game of advocacy whack-a-mole. You have to find the company that's inappropriately monitoring speech on behalf of police and then ask the social media platforms to revoke that access. And then another company pops up doing the same thing. You have to find them and so on. It is notable in this promotional material from Geofedia that they make the assumption that protester, and remember, protest is a protected First Amendment activity, is equal to a rioter. And this is an assumption that is heavily tied up with race. So we find that social media monitoring is pretty crappy, not just in the sense of how it is used to harass and focus attention on Black activists in the US, but also in terms of the quality, as we found in my research group. Digital Stakeout, another social media monitoring platform, we discovered was just using simple keyword searches. And the words that they used for a drug-related search, in their words, have a tendency to turn up a lot of tweets about the weather and little kids' birthday parties. All this focus on social movements doesn't affect all people equally. The examples I used weren't just cherry-picked, but yet they represent the working class, African Americans, and Native Americans. Indeed, individuals who engage with social movements generally do so from discontent, and that is often driven from a lack of privilege, that is, people fighting for their rights. The government is usually a stabilizing force, generally preferring the status quo and answering to those that benefit from the current state of things by construction. So it is worth the massive effort of surveillance, from on-the-ground infiltrators to mass surveillance, to maintain the structures of society, to the government, as they currently are, despite the fact that they result in massive inequality. And so those who fight for change tend to be oppressed, tend to be marginalized. And in the US, that segment of the population is highly overrepresented by Black and Indigenous people, and more generally, people of color. But let's shift gears a bit. Given what we know about surveillance technologies, starting with Snowden's disclosures in 2013, could we have a massive shutdown of the World Trade Organization, as we saw in the Battle of Seattle in December of 1999? Could that happen today? It was largely successful because security was caught off guard. But could we have such a large planned protest successfully shut down an event today with all of the predictive policing and predictive modeling that we have based on our social media and other data streams? How would the planning of such a huge event be done without being caught by the mechanisms of mass surveillance? Snowden's disclosures were a big turning point for me. And it was actually the start of my shift in research from theoretical computer science and algorithms into human factors and looking at privacy and surveillance. At the time, I felt like social change would be hopeless in what we knew to be this state of totalitarian mass surveillance. In 2013, there were few tools for encrypting your communications, and none of them were easy to use, and none of them were plug and play. But now we have lots of tools that protect your data and communications. It's still not doing everything that we need it to do. But even with the choices we have today, it sometimes feels like too many. So we have lots of trainings and recommendations on digital security to activists, including by me with the Civil Liberties Defense Center, as was advertised by Fox News. But now as a researcher, I'm asking myself, do these trainings work? What are activists' actual practices and what are their needs? Where are the gaps in terms of the tools they use and the tools that they require? And so my research, I do interviews with activists, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, mostly environmental and labor activists, because those are the groups that I have contacts with. We do surveys, we do follow-up surveys, we do interviews that are very in-depth. And by engaging with these communities that we know have a heightened need to protect their communications, we're finding more interesting to me, things about how people are really using these technologies on the ground, as opposed to interviewing, university students or interviewing Amazon Mechanical Turkers. So for example, we did a follow-up study of activists' use of email encryption. Back in 2013, we started training people using a complicated tool for email encryption, even though all of the research papers said, people can't use this tool, it's too difficult to use. There were lots of research papers on how people couldn't use it. And so we did a follow-up survey of the people we had trained and found that they could use it. they could use this complex tool. We found that sure, usability of the tool still mattered and had an impact on whether the users were still using it, 1 to 2 years later. But the level of risk that those individuals were undertaking in their activism also mattered. And unfortunately, it was counter to what you would hope. You would hope that individuals engaging in higher risk activism would be more likely to take extra efforts to protect their communications, but it was the reverse. They were less likely to put in that effort to protect their communications, whereas the people who were engaging in lower risk activism were more likely to continue to protect their communications. Through the in-depth interviews we've had more recently with activists' use of actual digital communication practices, which have been interesting because we're interviewing activists before the pandemic, at the start of the pandemic, and continuing on through the pandemic. We've definitely found that their practices have changed across time, but it's also been interesting to get snapshots of how those changes have happened and what changes activists have made. So we found that sure, activists do adopt alternative tools, but they do so with difficulty, and they run into barriers. And so, often, some activists will return to using mainstream tools, but will sometimes adapt their practices, treating mainstream tools as public spaces as opposed to private spaces. And of course, even during the pandemic, we still see many activists opting out of technology altogether, out of digital communications altogether, out of a concern over their privacy. And returning to in-person meetings, socially distanced meetings, as soon as they feel like it is safe to do. So that's a snapshot of my work. It wouldn't be possible without the collaboration I have with the Civil Liberties Defense Center. So please do check out that nonprofit's work at cldc.org. And with my collaborators in sociology, Kelsey Kretschmer and Brett Burkhart, and my graduate student, Alex Leclerc. And I'm passing it off now to Elissa Redmiles.
Thank you. Thanks. So I would like to talk about another marginalized and often invisible group and how technology can both help and cause harm. And that group is sex workers. So the UN most recently estimates that over 42 million people across the globe are engaged in sex work. And people who are engaged in sex work use technology in a variety of different ways. So some people conduct sex work exclusively online. For example, they do online camming, which is a form of sort of online stripping through platforms like Chatterbait, whereas more recently we've seen the rise of platforms like OnlyFans, where people can post adult content and earn money from subscription fees or interactions with fans of their content. And on the other side of the continuum, there are in-person sex workers who are engaged in what we might traditionally call prostitution or other forms of in-person sex work, who are using technology to do digital advertising, to communicate with clients, and in a myriad of different ways. And in today's talk, I'd like to focus on a long-term study that I conducted along with many wonderful collaborators on how in-person sex workers use technology. And in particular, our research project focused on how sex workers in 3 countries where sex work is legal use technology to do their work. And we collected data on this through both interviews and surveys with sex workers, which were conducted via end-to-end encrypted chat, phone, or video based on the participants' preferences, and who we recruited over a period of about 5 months, which I'm happy to go into more. And I also want to kind of point out before we dive into the details of what's going on here, that not only did we have the work that I'll present today reviewed, of course, by an ethics board, but also by a sex worker who served as a consultant for the project to ensure kind of appropriateness and ethics of the work that we are conducting with this group. What we find through our inquiry is that there are 6 primary ways that in-person sex workers use technology, or at least want to be able to use technology. The first is for advertising. And there's research, not our own, that has shown that the ability of sex workers to now do online advertising has significantly improved their quality of life in terms of revenue, as well as physical safety from how they're able to operate. So this is sort of not only a convenience, but also a safety factor. Sex workers also use technology in order to vet clients. So client vetting is the process through which sex workers ask within the sex work community or simply Google online, like you might do with online dating, to try to get a level of comfort with who their client is, whether they've harmed sex workers in the past, physically or through non-payment, and to verify that the person that they're setting up an appointment with is who they say they are. Sex workers also use technology to communicate with their clients, not only to set up appointments, but also to maintain a relationship with their clients between appointments, which is very important for maintaining a business. Sex workers also use or want to use technology for payment processing. There's high risk when you carry large amounts of cash for anyone, sex workers or anyone else. And there's evidence that robbers are quite aware that often sex workers may need to carry large amounts of cash, and so they may be targeted in particular. So there's a desire to use technology for payment processing. Sex workers also use technology to create support communities, despite the fact that the sex workers that we interviewed were in countries where their work was legal. Sex work is still quite marginalized, so you may not always know who else in your city is a sex worker, and so being able to create a digital community, not only for support, but also for education about new approaches to advertising or vetting or et cetera, is very valuable. And finally, sex workers use digital technology for activism, both sort of traditional activism, collective organization, and et cetera. But also many sex workers that we interviewed said that the mere act of being out or public about being a sex worker online was a form of activism, raising visibility for this marginalized group, as was sharing articles about sex worker regulations and various issues related to sex work. Despite the fact that sex workers want to use technology and do use technology in these variety of ways, much of the technology available has American views and moral values, which are traditionally very anti-sex work, encoded in them. And as a result, these views get imposed on sex workers, even those who are working legally across the globe. And I have some example quotes, but this was a consistent pattern that we saw in all of our data collection. And for example, one participant said, "Yeah, using PayPal would be great, but sex work is forbidden there. I have colleagues who did that. They used PayPal for sex work, and they got blocked for life by PayPal." And this participant went on to explain that, even if they left sex work in the future, they would still be permanently blocked. And this blocking can occur not just based on email address, where you can make a new one, but based on bank account or credit card number. So it can be quite difficult to be able to use the service again. Another worker said, "I had, I don't know how many followers at Instagram, and at some point I hadn't even posted nudes or anything. At some point it was just deleted. So that definitely hurt my business. That was pretty shitty." And for this worker, they felt like, well, I wasn't even doing work on this platform. I wasn't posting adult content, et cetera. But they went on to explain that it felt like just because they were a sex worker, they were being prevented from having an Instagram account. One participant sort of summarized these experiences and said, as someone who offers proactive erotic services, you're clearly at a disadvantage in the American-dominated internet. There's censorship, content that must not be present, page blocks, photos that must not be shown, and restrictions. And these restrictions go beyond regulating what work people can do on platforms to regulating identity, to regulating the very fact of being someone who works in the sex industry. we had multiple participants who brought up the example of Airbnb and said that they had been banned from Airbnb just for being a sex worker. One person even said, well, I got a third phone. I already had a phone for doing sex work. I had a phone for doing personal things. And that was the one I was trying to use Airbnb on because I wasn't trying to use it for work. And they figured out that I was a sex worker. So I got a third phone to try to be able to use this service. And our results are supported by multiple reports in the popular press about this practice of Airbnb in particular, banning people who are sex workers. And this investigative journalism turned up a patent for a company that Airbnb had bought, which revealed that it's likely a lot of this Airbnb's ability to detect who is a sex worker is based on them scraping sex worker advertisements and matching up the ID, the government ID that you have to provide to use Airbnb with those advertisements. And this connection between identities is A, something sex workers try very hard to prevent, and B, the patent, suggests that Airbnb may use this not only to ban people who are sex workers from using Airbnb, but also those who have mental health conditions that they think would make them bad guests, and so on and so forth. So while these issues are maybe most prominent currently for the sex working community, it seems it may be just a matter of time for other communities as well. Similarly, the Instagram and other community guidelines for online communities often say things like, no one can share content or create communities that facilitate, encourage, or coordinate commercial sexual services. This is despite the fact that the people trying to create these communities may be quite legally offering commercial sexual services. This prevents sex workers from, for example, doing any kind of activism, and also from even creating support communities where they can share instances of harm or ways of doing work more effectively, or even having water cooler talk in an industry that can be quite isolating. In general, this tech regulation of both work and identity intersects with sex workers' needs for safety. And so in our work, we found that there were 7 forms of safety for sex workers, and I'm going to give a couple of examples of how this technology censorship intersects with and can harm these safety needs. So sex workers, just like the rest of us, have a need for physical safety, which they try very hard to create, financial security, being able to set clear boundaries with their clients, so that they don't have any physical safety risks or financial security risks, say from non-payment. They have a desire for respect, both from their clients and from society. And so some of their use of technology, for example, for just being public about being a sex worker online, is a way to build and facilitate that respect that they very much need. Of course, they have a desire for digital privacy, just like anyone else, which is very much harmed by, for example, this Airbnb situation where their identity is linked, not even based on a phone number, not based on an account, but based on images. They have a need to have access to a community to help stay safe. And finally, legality very much intersects with the need for safety and with technology, where many participants that we spoke with over these 2 years expressed great confusion about how they can be doing work that's legal, that they're paying taxes on, and yet that work and their identity as someone who works in that industry is something not allowed. To give a few examples, this lack of ability to use digital payment processing reduces sex workers' physical safety, because as I mentioned, carrying large amounts of cash can be quite dangerous, and also threatens financial security because you have risk of clients not paying in cash, or choosing not to pay, or sending payments and then having an account frozen and all of the money taken. Similarly, the ability to advertise and work online has improved workers' physical safety. This comes from a report from the UK that showed this effect. And so there are many positives, both for sort of general crime rates as well as for sex workers' safety in particular. But being unable to advertise or to even, say, use Instagram to generate awareness can very much threaten these options. Banning communities or the discussion of sex work under the auspices that it might be facilitating human trafficking also prevents workers from simply having access to a community, which is one of the main sort of benefits purported to social media and a lot of the digital creation that we've had. And finally, sex workers have often experienced theft of their IP or advertising content, where even the platforms that are designed for sex worker advertisements will sometimes steal workers' content or images from their websites. And all of a sudden, workers will get a phone call from a new client who says, "Oh, I found your ad on, site XYZ." And the worker would say, "What? How? I didn't put an ad up there." And these places that have stolen their content are often adding services to the ads that they don't offer, which can lead to big boundary violations, which can lead to threats to physical safety. And this digital theft, where your content ends up somewhere you didn't expect, is of course very violating of personal and digital privacy. So as one sex worker we spoke with said, "I just want technology that considers me a person and not a product, but that's really asking a lot from the anonymous virtual world." And people often ask me, well, what can we do about this? The first thing is thinking much more deeply about how we regulate this kind of globalized tech censorship of both work that's conducted online and the identities that we permit online. While I've given examples through a sex work lens, these kinds of American views that have been encoded in tech products have had negative impacts on people who are trans, on drag queens, on various racially marginalized populations. And of course, within the sex work community, there's often an intersection of marginalized identities. So sex workers are often affected both in terms of their work identity as well as gender or race identities as well. Another key step is to incorporate and listen to marginalized voices in policy development, not after those policies have already been created. I join many others in stating that a lot of the regulations that may lead to restriction of conversations about sex work are targeting very real issues around trafficking, but they rarely incorporate, say, the sex working community that is affected most often by those regulations. And finally, many of the people that we worked with during this research project had their own capabilities to develop technology, but did not have the resources in terms of funding or certain types of training or et cetera, in order to actually build technology that would best support them. And so they were stuck using technology that did treat them as a product rather than a person. So really providing support to allow marginalized communities to be key developers of both policy and technology. Thank you, and I'm happy to hand things over to Matt now.
Okay, I think we should be good. All right, so again, I just want to thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak. Also to Glencora for the work with directly impacted communities, and Elissa with the work on sex workers in marginalized communities. I'm Matt Mitchell, and I founded cryptoharlem. And cryptoharlem is kind of cybersecurity for the people, is what we call it. It's an educational organization that works to educate folks in the inner city, specifically directly impacted marginalized communities, which increasingly means Black and brown communities inside the United States. What cryptoharlem does is advocacy work, and we also do training. We also do professional development. We feel that directly impacted communities will solve their own problems, and they're the only ones who will have the wherewithal and the fortitude and the energy to do so. But that requires education. That requires development. It requires resources. And we also make guides as quickly as we can, kind of working on the ground with marginalized communities. Originally, Crypto Harlem started out as something in a community center in Harlem. But because of COVID-19, there is no community center as it's closed. So we've moved online, and we use live streaming to reach a new audience. It's different because in the community center, we can have like Chatham House rules, and we can invite folks in. We would travel to Miami and Los Angeles and Chicago and do Crypto Harlem events there. But now it's completely online, recorded, and it's about reaching a larger audience, but a very different type of message, but still in empowering people to solve their own problems. One group that we work with a lot is the Movement for Black Lives, which is a network of 150 different racial justice organizations inside the United States. That includes like well-known organizations like Black Lives Matter Global, and other organizations maybe not as well known, but still very impactful, working together in solidarity. And what we saw last year with the moment of racial reckoning, the George Floyd protest in the United States, is there's a huge amount of surveillance against these communities, right? Just yesterday, the Electronic Frontier Foundation published their report on Ring cameras and the LAPD trying to get access from Amazon to identify protesters from, the Ring doorbell camera just kind of pointed out into the streets. We have for years, because we've been working with M4BL for many, many years now. We've found evidence of monitoring of protest, social media, whether it's Geophidia or Dataminer or other companies that have law enforcement contracts. It's not a single person scrolling through a social media feed. It's a large drinking of the fire hose of social media data to parse out keywords and identify individuals. Okay. Here's an example of the kind of guides that we create, which are to the point, like one sheet, very basic, on what tools you can use when you organize and you protest, when you're out in the streets. And we'll actually go to the protest, we'll go out into the streets, we'll monitor radio, we'll do whatever we can to keep people safe when it comes to the digital and electronic side of things. Unfortunately, exercising your constitutional rights and your rights in this country are not, they come at a cost and come at a high price, and directly impacted communities pay that price higher than others, right? And what we try to do is explain, if you're going to do these things, as you should, and you have a duty to protect yourselves and to protect your community, these are the ways that you can do it in a way that mitigates that harm, lessens that harm. Okay. In inner city communities, in Black and Brown communities, people are living in a kind of dystopian future. It's much different than a neighborhood right next door, even though you might be in the same city, you might be in the same state. And what you'll find is many layers of surveillance, whether it comes from the state and the government or whether it comes from corporations. And what it ends up creating is a reality where you're surveilled from the minute you wake up to basically the moment you go to sleep. In this case here, which is from 2014, around the corner from my place in Harlem, Jelani Henry, because of Facebook posts, because of contacts in his phone, that would link him to different people, he spent 18 months in prison, without any real reason, right? And then was released at the end of the 18 months, right? There wasn't a trial or anything like that. And, had he signed a plea deal or had he had some admissions of guilt, he would have been charged and the story wouldn't have been as picked up. And, I've spoken to Jelani many times about his experience, and there are very few of these perfect example cases of a young person who, because of what we call a Facebook takedown or social media takedown, their data leads to them being charged with anything from gang conspiracy charges or whatever. that they don't end up like signing a plea deal, or they don't have any past that's like linked to anything like that. So I think like that's the bigger issue, right? Another issue that faces the community, right, are facial recognition and device seizure. And with device seizure, what we find is, you know, in Upturn, which is a group in DC, a nonprofit organization focused on racial equity and technology, has a report called Mass Extraction, which kind of covers a lot of this. And what we see is like the cost for special tools that are only available to security forces and law enforcement to extract data from phones, right, are so low that this technology is widely distributed across the United States. And if, you know, what often happens is someone is like kind of stopped and asked for their phone, and then their phone is, you know, cloned or copied or scanned or unlocked, and that evidence is used against them. And this happens to, you know, folks who work in racial justice, but also folks who work in reproductive justice and abortion rights. And, you know, the biggest issue with facial recognition is the corpus of data that's used, right? Like the models, they're not designed for Black and brown faces. And so we have like, you know, very inaccurate and very problematic, you know, issues of racial bias in how these algorithms are, you know, executed and how they work. And that leads to wrongful accusation of many people of crimes, right? But also leads to from the community, like, you know, a feeling that, you know, you're being othered, which you are, right? You know, there's a suspicion that you're doing something wrong. And with, you know, the idea is we can remove bias by, instead of asking you or meeting with you or talking to you, just doing virtual lineups. But these virtual lineups, which happen like unbeknownst to you, right, because of your social media data or your data trail on the internet, or because of your face in a camera, the algorithm doesn't know how to see you, doesn't recognize you as like a normal human being, and oftentimes leads to quite negative outcomes, right? There's a recent movement in New York called Ban the Scan, which is to ban facial recognition and to kind of like address, especially amongst law enforcement, use of facial recognition. You know, cryptoharlem and myself, we've been involved with this thing called POST, which was an initial movement nationwide of the ACLU, which was, and back then it was called CCOPS, which was community control of police surveillance. And in New York, we have like a POST law, like a POST regulation, which is, you know, oversight over surveillance technology that's used by the police. It's not where it needs to be. It's not perfect. You know, law enforcement tends to push back. And when we, you know, oftentimes we're finding out about technologies accidentally, right? You know, some of them seem so ridiculous, like there's a van that can use radiation to scan through walls, but it's true. But because of Post Act and because of what's going on recently, the NYPD has to release the technologies that they're using and basically how they use them. This is very recent, and we've just, you know, like I believe just like a month or two ago, received like the first, you know, piece of information, which is like pages and pages of different technologies, like vaguely communicated and expressed, in my opinion. But it's so much easier than stumbling upon these. And what we find is like quite a dragnet of surveillance technologies, but only targeted in certain communities, and data that kind of reinforces this over-policing of, you know, Black and brown communities. Okay. Forward and I'll play that. Okay. Other work that I do, unbeknownst to the, you know, like unrelated, I would say, to the work that I do in the Black community, is working with the Ford Foundation, which is institutional philanthropy. And there is a need for organizations that are supported and funded to have better digital security. These are the organizations that kind of are there for marginalized groups and communities, doing advocacy work, doing work on the ground, kind of filling the gap between the people and the government. But at the same time, these civil society organizations and nonprofits don't always have the best digital security and cybersecurity. They're often targeted. They're pushing the status quo, and sometimes the status quo pushes back, and that's often done through a digital attack. And so what this tool does is it uses like my experience and the experience of a team of contractors that I put together to ask simple kind of questions, kind of like a Facebook quiz, like, which character on this TV show are you? And at the end, give you a personalized assessment. So, you see this like little harmless little cat, because it's called the cybersecurity assessment tool. It's kind of cute. You fill out a basic survey that's only a few pages long. And then it generates for you a report that tells you in each of these areas how you scored, whether it was below or reasonable or high, compared to what we feel you should be in that area. Then no matter where you're scoring, it gives you next steps and a path forward. And this is something that I've always encountered people asking, like, is there something like this? And so I decided to build it last year. We just launched it in November. It's in beta right now. It's going to be translated into Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, Arabic, Indonesian, and we'll see like what other languages to support more communities. Okay. And that is my work. I'm happy and excited to get into the panel.
Great. Thank you, everybody. These are great talks, really interesting. So before we get into the panel, I did have a question that I wanted to ask each of you. So as I said, I'm a big fan of your work. I find it really inspiring. And one of the things that I really like about what you're doing is that the work that you've done, I don't think is incentivized, right? Like, I feel like you're doing work because, you found that it was important, but really it's not aligned with the incentives that we usually have in technology. And so because of that, I'm really curious about how you got started and why you started this work and kind of like the story behind it. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And we can go in the order that we, that we heard the talks. So yeah, Cora.
Yeah, thanks. Getting tenure really helped. Right. I got tenure. And so I felt like, oh, now I can do what I want. I was also awarded a endowed professorship, which gave me sort of a pot of money that I could do whatever I wanted with. And even though it wasn't a big pot of money, it did get me started on actually being able to convert my research into this. So at the time I had been doing outreach work with the Civil Liberties Defense Center, but I hadn't carved out space in my profession for that. And that grew out of the Snowden disclosures. That really woke me up and said, I need to help out in some way. And that was the way that I was able to. So that small pot of money from my university really helped. But it is, it's hard to, it was hard to start publishing in a new area and in an area that didn't really fall into like a natural disciplinary place. So figuring out where do I publish this work? Finding collaborators, starting interdisciplinary work and working with sociologists that work in a much different way from computer scientists and figuring that out. Initially, I thought, the NSF will never fund this. And so I tried getting money from foundations and eventually NSF did fund this work, which has been great. And I'm hoping I'll be able to keep that going as it moves forward.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess this work started in two different ways for me. The first was I work on security in general and would frequently hear, oh, if only users knew the risks, then they would use the security behaviors. And I was sort of thinking about okay, what are some groups of users who have really tangible risks? And sex workers were a group that I knew had large physical safety, digital privacy, et cetera, risks. And I was like, okay, let's understand are they using all these digital security tools? Or if not, then clearly the tools are very broken and we need to be figuring something else out. The secondary part was I've always felt very strongly that people have a right to do the kind of work that they want to do and to have the resources they need to do that work. And that I saw like no study of sex work in, certainly not in like the security and privacy community, but also very little study even in like human-computer interaction, or like outside of specialized, sex or gender studies or public health types of spaces. And particularly public health has this sort of medical or there's something wrong with it lens to it. And so I really wanted to be able to take like a broad lens. And to the not being incentivized perspective, I was very lucky that before I was even at the Max Planck Institute, they were willing to fund this work along with a collaborator who is a communications and sociology scholar at the University of Zurich. And despite that funding initially, when I proposed the project, the person who was willing to fund it, we had sort of a long conversation about whether sex work was inherently exploitive. And one of his other, female grad students sort of wandered by and she was like, oh, hey, I agree with Elissa, like all relationships are on a continuum, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, okay, I'm gonna have to read more about it. I'll fund the work anyway, but now I have to go do some reading. So that was how that happened.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I had a job, which was good, and I'm Black, so that also was like a self-defense kind of incentive. I was working as a data journalist at the New York Times, and it was around the time of the Trayvon Martin acquittal of George Zimmerman, and I just felt, I need to do something. So I'm a computer hacker. I'll just do that. I'll just talk to my community about the surveillance around us and do more research, but actionable, and just like showing people exactly how to get around the problems. And I think, there's a lot of great research and there's a lot of great code and technology, but the research isn't done by the people affected, and the code isn't written for the people or by the people affected. And so that causes a million problems. And I realized quite quickly, it's so much easier to teach folks who are directly affected how to write their own app or tool or do their own research than it takes to like turn the best app developer woke. Like, good luck with that. You know what I'm saying? It's not happening. So yeah. And, Ford Foundation, where I work now, strangely, they had a fellowship program with Mozilla to build this field called public interest technology. And I applied. They only were taking like 8 people out of hundreds of applicants. And I was like, okay, if I get this, I'm just going to do this till the wheels fall off. I'm just going to stay on this course forever. And if I don't, I'll just make that money. And I got in. So that's what was like kind of like the real thing that allowed me to do this low incentive work full time, all time.
But Matt, like you and I talked a little bit about this, but like I'm curious also, can you talk a little bit about the logistical issues? I mean, to get this off the ground, right? You were out there in the streets passing out flyers. Like, can you talk about that, about the just the real work?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would recommend it. Please do this. But like the easy part was finding the community center and convincing them to give me the space and time. Like I do this thing, it was every month for 3 hours, right? So, because working poor, folks, sometimes people just got a job, or some people can only stop by for an hour. So you do it for a window, and so you could touch the community. Some people come in from the beginning, they leave at the end, but that's the best way to do it. That's what I realized, like trial and error, you'll learn. And that also meant, I spent 3 hours every month also promoting it. So that's just 6 hours right there, just talking about this thing, so you make flyers, you hand them out, you get a little street team, people like, Starbucks gift cards maybe work where you are, but cash works where I am. So, you talk to people who have respect in the community, moms and of the mosque and pastors of the churches, and folks who just like, yo, this is my block and I'm holding down this corner. They'll get people to show up for you. Once you convince them, you're good. The salon, things that COVID is really challenging. And it's about getting a lot of no's, and it's an uphill grind, and nobody really is really trying to hear you, right, in the beginning. So there's something to be said for, if you really want to reach the people who are not being reached, if you really want to empower the people who need to be empowered, you don't need to look like them, you know what I'm saying? But you need to have the heart and fortitude to deal with all of that uphill grind, because not until the 10th event is it going to start feeling like there's any momentum. And that's why we don't see these things, right? These communities that are directly affected by these things. And the reason why we need, crypto for the people and cybersecurity for the people and, safety and security is because it's a game, right? The whole thing is set up to keep these folks on the bottom, whether they're workers who are trying to organize, whether they're sex workers who are trying to exist, right? And, we must do our great academic studies and research, but we also must give back some time to the reality of the real world.
Yeah. That's great. So I have a question also for Elissa and Cora. So another thing I like about your work is that it's, of course it's computer science research and there's quantitative aspects to it, but I feel like there's a lot of qualitative aspects to your work. And I think that's great. And I'm curious as to, how you feel about kind of quantitative versus qualitative methods and how you kind of balance the two in your particular research.
Go ahead, Elissa.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is a great question, sort of leaping off of Matt's point a little bit, right? I think there's qualitative in terms of methods, and then there's qualitative also in terms of experience. So like even to recruit sex workers as participants, I spent a lot of time like going into brothels and leaving flyers under cigarette tables and having bouncers get really mad at me and various other things. And so I think there's sort of many layers of methodology, and that there's like the broader context that's qualitative. And that's something that's often really hard to put in a research paper, right? Because I can't, if I just write about my experience, that's not something someone can peer review. And then I think in terms of mixed methods work, I always try to think about like, what is the problem or the question I'm trying to answer? And then I find a method from there. And sometimes that means you're doing an interview study. Sometimes it means you're doing a participatory design study to figure out how are we going to build that tool that the interview studies told us that we needed to build. And then it maybe moves into quantitative, where like we did follow-up surveys because there were themes particularly around like activism and use of security tools that we wanted to understand, like, okay, does that generalize to a bigger population? Or in the case of like, let's create a tool to help people do vetting, can we quantitatively evaluate like whether that works? And sometimes it means using like natural language processing, so we can go through a ton of forum data and find patterns to like justify to the outside world why these things matter. So I think like it both matters what question you're trying to answer and who you're trying to make the argument to, and what kind of evidence those people need to kind of believe in the thing that maybe you already know is a problem.
I think, I agree with everything Elissa said. Myself, I'm not trained as a qualitative researcher. I'm not even trained as a quantitative researcher. I was a theoretical computer scientist. I knew how to prove theorems. So I'm well outside my comfort zone, and I lean heavily on my sociology collaborators to make sure our research methods are robust. But, the research is by necessity qualitative. I'm never going to be able to like get a statistically robust sample of activists, right? I would not feel comfortable cold calling, an activist group to ask them about their digital security practices, because I think that those kind of questions should be asked out of a trust relationship. So, it starts with talking to the groups that I've supported through my outreach with the Civil Liberties Defense Center, and then from there snowballing out so that there is that trust relationship there. And so, it's going to be qualitative. I think there's still interesting things that are there. And I think, if I had to critique my own work, is that, my sampling is biased by, it's mostly groups in the Pacific Northwest, mostly, labor and environmental organizers, and I think, I need to do the work of partnering with other groups that have those close relationships with other groups that I can't reach.
Great. So I have more questions, but I want to open it up to the audience. So we have one question from an anonymous, where it's an anonymous question. So What are some examples of technology that has been built that you believe actively promotes racial justice or empowers people of color, perhaps against law enforcement or surveillance, as opposed to just does no harm? So, you know, empowering versus just doing no harm. So maybe we can start with Matt.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I will say things like Bridgeify, which is like, you know, it's a Mexican app. What it does is allows you to send a message to someone without cell phone service. You just use Bluetooth. So if I'm in a protest, right? Like if you go out into the streets, you're going to have like not the best cell phone signal to begin with, because towers are designed in a way where the more people on them, the weaker it gets. You go to a festival, you know, you've experienced that. Now imagine there's also devices there that interfere with your cell phone. And that's what it's like for your average protester when we're seeing folks. This technology allows you to send a message and just use Bluetooth to send it to the person next to you. And it makes a mesh network. So the more people using it, the stronger it gets and the further that message can go. And they recently changed it a couple months ago. So it's encrypted with the same technology that's used in Signal, the very popular messaging app. And I really liked that the way that they were thinking about this tech, and it was kind of accidental. They didn't try to make an activist tech. They just needed a proof of concept for their mesh network tech. But I think it's something that actually empowers folks, right? It actually gives folks what they need. Like, there are examples of things like popular apps like Signal where you can say, okay, it gives you encryption, but the reality is because your phone's going to get taken from you and your Signal group is just behind whatever your weak passcode is, everyone's going to see, who that group's phone numbers are. Those people are going to get got. So at the end of the day, it's about like really understanding how it applies in reality and how people get into issues and how things cause problems. So yeah, Bridgeify to me is a good example.
That's great, thank you. Elissa?
Yeah, I'm not sure that, at least in this particular context, I have an example for people of color specifically, but I have an example for, certainly for sex workers, many of whom are people of color. And one example is in Ireland, there's an application for client vetting where you can determine if a client is sort of safe. And this application is basically a crowdsourcing in which sex workers can report an incident of harm and link it to a particular like email address or phone number or something like that, or profile in an advertising website. And then if you get contacted by someone who's had a certain threshold number of reports, it'll show up kind of blinking yellow on your phone or on the application so that you have sort of an instant recognition that this might be a person who can cause harm. Now, of course, there are sort of negatives to this, right? You can have false reports, et cetera. But one of the key pieces of context here is that most sex work advertising websites allow clients to leave reviews on sex workers, but not the other way around. And so it's really difficult for sex workers to do vetting, but very easy for clients to do vetting. So this is one of the best things I've seen, but it's very Ireland specific. So what I've heard is that sex workers wanted to build something like this in Spain, and they couldn't get like the 7,000 euros that would be required to build it. And so this is sort of an example of like how resources and empowering like communities to be able to build their own software or having volunteers who can help build it can be really powerful, even for small, relatively small amounts of money, like 7,000 euros.
Cora?
The only one that really came to mind was something called Pirate Box, and I haven't thought about it in a while, and I just looked it up and it doesn't exist anymore. But it was like a way to create, for one person to create a local network that anyone could connect to. And it had sort of simple like upload and download files and videos and a simple chat feature that you could use without an active internet connection. But it doesn't exist anymore. I think you could still download it and run it, but it's not maintained, which is not a good sign, unfortunately. And that's, this is what I see with a lot of technologies. Like sometimes you see something like Signal, which takes off and continues for the long term. And I think we, believe it'll be around for a little while, but then these other things will pop up and exist for a little while and then, run out of resources and disappear, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a big problem. So we have another set of questions. So first of all, the attendee is want to thank you for your amazing talks. And there's one question for Cora. So how do you feel about the same tools and advice that is being used, for example, to help climate activists, also being used to organize, say, a raid on the US Capitol, right? So like, how do you feel about sort of these different, one technology being used for different purposes?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that, communication should be private, regardless of what communications you're protecting. And, the prevention of crime should be done, the old fashioned way, I think, by knowing your communities, and knowing where the problems are, as opposed to dragnet surveillance. I would never give a digital security training to a group whose purpose I didn't believe in, right? But yeah, I know when I put out materials online, yeah, anyone can use that. And that's just sort of the drawback. But anything that, anything that comes down on, movements that I don't agree with tend to come down a lot harder on the movements that I do agree with. Like reactionary movements just don't get the same attention by the US government, right? There was a reporting by The Intercept that went, really in depth, showing that there were hundreds of crimes that were perpetrated by right-wing extremist movements that were, tried at the federal level, but did not get anti-terrorism laws thrown at them when they would qualify for anti-terrorism, charges, terrorism charges. Whereas on the left, that's where we see them happening, right? Like these terrorism laws are thrown against environmental activists and animal rights activists and movement for Black Lives activists. And so, I think we just need to do whatever we can to protect liberatory movements because they need the protection. And it's really the real problem is that the reactionary movements just don't get the same kind of state suppression.
Thank you. There's also a question for Elissa. So the question says that, so you mentioned the prudishness of American apps, but the person asking the question feels that there are also many people in other countries actually see US culture as being very permissive, and that being embodied in US apps, and that can bother, non-US communities. And so they're curious about your thoughts on this kind of cultural arbitrage and like, how do we navigate these differences in cultures?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that the kind of imposition of American views, be they permissive or, prudish in either direction on, the globe, because American tech companies were the ones that initially created these platforms and gained users, is absolutely a problem in both directions. And I think that sort of taking, right, the descriptive ethics view, which is that we learn from the population about their beliefs, and this is how we set rules, this is how we create laws, and every country has their own laws and regulations, which we may or may not, agree with, but they're theoretically established by the population. One of the things we've seen with tech is that type of system has really generally not been reflected. There are a few cases where tech companies will follow individual country laws, but they've sort of been left to their own devices about which of those laws they choose to respect or not respect. And obviously, having different laws for different internet users, so to speak, can lead to some trouble having like global communities, which is one of the big powers of the internet. But tech companies and computer scientists have solved many very difficult problems. And this seems like one that we can also start to think more deeply about, like, how do we, from a computational perspective, negotiate these kinds of things? We're being forced to do this a bit with like GDPR, but how do we go further with that and respect laws and cultures, and not just sort of default to the American view until, you know, a country or a prime minister yells loudly enough that a country's laws get respected. So I think we have a lot more work to do, and I don't have a single line answer, but it's a problem in both directions.
Thank you. So there's a question by, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Kiri Miller. So they're teaching a class right now on biases in AI and machine learning. They just watched the documentary Coded Bias, so everybody should watch that, by the way. And so one question that came up is the following. So should design stage interventions aim to create unbiased algorithms, right? So should we be focusing on creating unbiased AI? Or should we be focusing on compensating for known biases? And this brings up the following interesting notion, which is, what would it mean to think about algorithmic reparations? So before you take a stab at this, I just want to mention that we will have an event later on in the semester that is really focused on AI specifically and biases. But if you happen to have any thoughts, I'd like to hear them.
I think a lot about this. I don't really do much work in this area, but I read a lot of the papers. I don't think we should be doing algorithmic decision making. And there was a great argument made by someone whose name I was not able to find after I watched the panel, and didn't think about it for another 6 months. But so this is not my own argument, but borrowed from someone else. That when you do algorithmic decision making, you're concentrating power, and concentrating power is typically like a bad thing, right? So you're taking the power of making decisions out of the hands of people who know the communities, for example, social workers or frontline healthcare practitioners, and putting it into the hands of like people living in Silicon Valley making algorithms, making products that will make the decision for you, who have no connection, right? So it's sort of like comparing, right, like someone who owns a mom and pop shop to Jeff Bezos, right? Like the person who runs a small business has to look his workers in the face every day. He could still abuse them, but there's a more personal connection than Jeff Bezos has had to his workers. And so that's what I worry about for algorithmic bias. I mean, there have been arguments saying that, like you can actually overcome people's personal biases by injecting with algorithms, but I think it should be like anything that, when we do admissions for schools, right, you don't just use test scores to determine whether or not someone gets in. You can use it as a part of a much more holistic view, right? So maybe you could use the output of an algorithmic decision-making system as like one of many elements, but not taking all of the power out of the people who have relationships with those communities.
Yeah, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's like this. If like Boeing made a 737 MAX and it crashed and people died, it's a horrible tragedy. And then they flew another one and it crashed and people died and it was a horrible tragedy. We wouldn't let them just keep flying it until they got it right? It's like, that's just not how things work. Part of why bias in algorithms is an arguable issue is because of who it affects. And if it was biased towards the marginalized Black and brown folks to the benefit of them, we would fix it. So, we have so many amazing people who are gifted, computer scientists and, people who understand like machine learning and, like I'm a software engineer, I understand the complexities of it. They're screaming at the top of their lungs, this is horrible. It's not worth the harms. Look at what's happening. We should just listen to them. So can we get this right and get machines to like, not exacerbate the worst of the people who make them, right? Yeah, well, maybe one of the people who make them don't have those things, right? When we have sex workers writing the algorithms and we have Black and brown communities and workers and indigenous communities writing the code, maybe the code will be less biased. But until then, I think it's time to hit pause.
Yeah. Elissa?
Yeah, I very much agree with what's been shared. And I think, I very much agree with Matt's point. There's a lot that we roll out in the world without testing it. And I often come back to the analogy of healthcare, right? Like the standards of evidence before we make a recommendation of a drug or even a particular like health protective action are much, much more rigorous than the standards of evidence. We don't even really have a concept of standards of evidence in computing, but they're much more rigorous than the standards of evidence that we do apply. And this comes even to silly things, right? Not even to things like algorithms, but to silly things like mandating password changes or use of two-factor authentication. We rarely have the evidence to support, how does this help? How could it hurt? Is the trade-off correct? Okay, now let's move forward. And so even sort of, rationality, utility optimizing economists would sort of be scratching their head if they looked at a lot of the decisions we made. The other point I wanted to make is as we try to fix these things, right? Coming off of Glencora's point, a lot of my work focuses on like, how do we bake in the voice of the population in these technologies? Like, how do you weight which features you use in the algorithm based on people's perceptions? But inherently, right, in people's perceptions, there are biases, even if I well sample the whole population statistically, et cetera. And that's an issue that's a problem outside of technology, right? Like these beliefs are the things that in theory set our laws, which then are the things that determine what happens online and et cetera. So, we have some work amongst ourselves as people that we have to do too, in addition to sort of creating evidence and test beds and et cetera on the tech side.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like, at least from my perspective, I think our culture as technologists is problematic, right? And of course, in many ways, but, we bringing it back to security, surveillance, and privacy, for example, we build the internet and we build all this technical infrastructure without thinking about security. It's like, let's just build it. Right? Let's not think about risks. Let's not think about negative outcomes. We can build this, so let's do it, right? And now we're dealing with the consequences of having insecure, technologies and privacy being broken and all these issues. And it's the same thing. It's the same mentality and the same culture that seems to be happening in AI and machine learning. We can, let's just do it, right? Without really reflecting carefully about whether we should do it and how should we do it if we are going to do it. It's always after the fact, and that's that's an issue with our culture as technologists. I think that we definitely need to be thinking about. And actually, this ties into another question, which is, what do you think is the place for interdisciplinary, justice-oriented, socially informed work like yours in a traditional computer science department? So I think this links to this issue of culture, and so I'd love to hear what you all think about it. Maybe Cora, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that this, that this research can take place in a computer science department, because I think there's a lot of, we have to educate our students and try to, if this research was not at all taking place in computer science, all we would get is technocentric people who are like, oh, you just code and produce, and who cares about the impacts, as you were saying, Seny. And so I think it's great that we can have people working in these areas and having their academic home be in computer science, so that education can take place. But expect an upward battle, right? If you're doing it, I think some departments are really good about evaluating candidates in a fair way and bringing candidates in who have a holistic view of their research and do interdisciplinary research. But even in those departments, I'm sure you're going to get there, and there's going to be like traditional full professors who won't be happy about what you want to offer. As an example, in my department, where I have many amazing colleagues, I wanted to offer a graduate seminar on difference, power, and discrimination. And a certain senior faculty member wanted that to actually go to a vote, right? Can I offer this graduate seminar that is optional to our grad students when no other graduate seminar on any topic is ever brought to faculty vote? So I'm just like, how is this, how how is this appropriate, right? That you're treating, you know, the teaching that I want to do differently from the teaching that our other faculty do. So, you know, I think you have to be prepared to have a thick skin, and have good mentoring, especially if you're on the tenure track, to make sure that you'll be fairly evaluated as you go through. But I think it's definitely worth that fight.
Right. And your course is interdisciplinary. You co-teach it with somebody from a different department. Is that right?
Oh, so yeah. So the undergraduate course, Communication, Security, and Social Movements, I didn't have to get permission from the faculty. I just kind of like slid it through the undergraduate curriculum committee and didn't make much noise about it. And now it exists. Oh, and it's going online starting next quarter. So anyone can take it, which will be great. Yeah, so initially, so the first few offerings, I did have a history professor who came and taught a couple of the sessions with me until I sort of felt like I was able to do that material justice myself. You know, unfortunately, we don't really have a mechanism. This is a problem with the, you know, structural problem. We don't have a mechanism to really support co-teaching, especially across college boundaries, like College of Liberal Arts with College of Engineering. It's like, no, you know, it'd be like, you just end up teaching twice as much if you want to, you know, co-teach classes. But it was definitely developed with other disciplinary experts involved.
Right, great, thank you. Matt, did you have any?
Well, you know, I was just thinking, you know, I was looking at this, I was doing some research for Black History Month on early cryptographers and cryptology. And I found, you know, there's this unit in the NSA, and it was a segregated unit in the 1940s. People didn't even realize this team even existed. They were just lost to history. They were discovered in the 90s. And looking at that picture, I just was struck on, that's what it'll look like in the future when we think about when we don't center justice. Because then we're centering injustice, right? And that's how ridiculous it'll look like when we think about programs that are like, this is with ethics, this is with justice, this is with like centering the voice of queer people or whatever, you know? And we just have to get there, because those in the seats of power, you know, academia's game, and thanks to you, the folks on this panel, and you know, yourself and the folks at Brown who, you know, are trying to challenge some of that. But you know, people just have to die out. Tenure needs to fade, and there'll be a replacement. It'll, and until then, just fight the good fight. You know, like have that thick skin, and you know, sometimes you got to ask forgiveness instead of permission, like Glencora with the undergrad program, and other times you just got to work your way till you have that vote. But understand that it's wrong, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Elissa? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess kind of 3 points on this. The first is I often find the students, be it undergrad or PhD student, are really enthusiastic about the work. It tends to more be faculty who are skeptical, or who kind of are willing to tolerate it in exchange for the more traditional work that goes in the right venues. But I think there's still a big fight to fight, in the sense that, right, I remember the first paper I wrote in grad school was a qualitative paper about nothing particularly exciting. And the chair of our center said, "Oh, you did this? Well, I guess because it was published there, it's okay, but I think this is like complete nonsense," right? And I remember thinking like, if this thing about security advice is nonsense, then like the real ideas are definitely going to be way too far outside of the Department of Nonsense. So I think that's sort of one, is to Matt's point, like a cultural thing. And I think I am happy to see that students at least don't necessarily feel this way. I think 2 is definitely like a support and resources type thing, right? So when I was in the US, had a couple of experiences, both industry and like federal funding wise, right? Where it was like, oh, I really see the value in this work, but once I passed it up, we have a PR problem. And so I think the patience to see that, like, even if you're studying something that's maybe not acceptable, there are a lot of broader implications from that work, and there are things we can learn. And if we get comfortable with what isn't comfortable, that's the only time we can learn things. If we kind of shut it down immediately, we're not going to make any progress. And the third thing, I guess, is that, you know, part of the reason that I ended up in Europe was because it was just easier to do the work there and to fund the work, and I didn't have the patience and had the luxury of being able to go to like wait through for tenure to be able to do the work that I really wanted to be doing. And that doesn't mean that I don't still do the traditional work that I get patted on the head for, but at least now I am able to do the stuff that makes me excited sooner. And yeah, I've never been one to wait very patiently.
Great. So we have another question by Luis Fregoso. So he thanks the speakers for their great presentations. And he's curious, so have you identified the use of surveillance technologies in migration cases and not just in the US? So I'll just mention before if anybody has any thoughts, but the surveillance, there's a huge intersection between surveillance technologies and migration. That is a real issue. In the class that I teach during the fall, we read about and talked about how surveillance technologies was being deployed at the border in particular with these sort of quote unquote smart borders, where they're using drones and other kinds of technologies. And that's having a lot of different impacts on migration that weren't necessarily predicted, and it's leading to a lot of really negative outcomes and really dangerous outcomes. You know, it's changing the routes that people take, and it's making them take more dangerous routes, which is increasing the likelihood of deaths as well. So, but I don't know if any of you have encountered this at all in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I did some work with International Committee for the Red Cross, and I would just say that one of the few things you'll see on someone who embarks on this dangerous journey is a cell phone in a Ziploc bag. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that is not lost on people who want to prevent and push and harm these folks. And so there's a lot of surveillance, whether it's tracking of where the cell phone pings are, to just like different ways of processing, right? Whether it's capturing biometrics, not handling that data in any kind of care or privacy or dignity. Privacy International in the UK is their headquarters. They do a lot of work on this, and I'll just put a link out in the chat for folks who were able to like attend this thing. But it's a big part of it. It's there, you find the movements of marginalized people. People want to know exactly where, when, and how many, what direction, and how to harm, not just prevent, stop, or improve.
I would say, migration exclusively, I haven't worked on as much, but over half of sex workers in the EU, and even more so in other parts of the world, are migrants. And a lot of the data that we collected, people will wipe their entire phone, not bring their work phone with them, etc., when they do need to cross borders, in part for those reasons.
Great. Cora, I don't know if you had any. Yeah.
I don't have much more to add, but that folks have much fewer rights at a border than anywhere else in the U.S., and the border is very big. Right. I actually don't remember the number of miles, but it's at least 50 miles from a border is considered the border, including coastal waters. Right. And so, you have much fewer rights in terms of what can be done. So, device seizure and so on. But, I've definitely taken a specialty in like focusing on like US centered rights and what tools are available, because, as soon as you go internationally, like there's different risks that people face just by using certain encryption tools can have a much, can actually be riskier. Like it might be better to use WhatsApp in some jurisdictions than Signal, because you could get into trouble for using Signal, for example. And so I think, there is definitely like a need to take into consideration like the unique situation that people have based on where they live and where they work.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're a little bit past time. So yeah, I just wanted to thank the speakers for these really great and inspiring talks and work as well. So I'm really glad we got to do this. And thank you to everybody who attended for the great questions. I hope you found this interesting and inspiring. I definitely did. And also wanted to thank CSREA and all the folks on the CSREA team for, putting the event together. They did a wonderful job. And yeah, hope to see you at our second event and our third event as well. So yeah, thank you, everybody. I'll give you a clap.
Thank you, Seny.